The morning sun hadn't fully risen when Andrew stepped out of his apartment building, pulling his worn jacket closer against the chilly autumn breeze. At 16, he was already familiar with the weight of responsibility that came with being the man of the house. His mom had already left for her first job at the local diner 2 hours ago and wouldn't be home until late tonight after finishing her shift at the convenience store. Andrew checked his phone, 6:45 a.m. Perfect timing for the bus that would take him to school. The street was quiet except for the distant sound of cars and the rustling of fallen leaves dancing across the sidewalk. The familiar smell of fresh bread from the bakery down the street made his stomach growl, reminding him of the simple breakfast he packed: 2 peanut butter sandwiches and an apple from yesterday's grocery run. As he walked to the bus stop, Andrew thought about the upcoming physics test. He'd stayed up until midnight studying, determined to maintain his spot at the top of his class. His mom always said education was their ticket to a better life, and he took those words to heart. His backpack felt especially heavy today. Besides his textbooks, he'd packed his basketball gear for afternoon practice. Coach had hinted that college scouts might be attending their next game, and Andrew wasn't about to let this opportunity slip away. The bus stop was already crowded with the usual morning faces: the guy in a wrinkled suit who always seemed to be running late, the elderly twins who spoke in whispers, and a group of construction workers heading to their site. Andrew nodded politely to Mrs. Wilson, his former middle school librarian, who always saved him the daily newspaper's crossword puzzle. "Big game coming up?" she asked, noticing his basketball shoes peeking out of his backpack. "Yes, ma'am," Andrew replied with a smile. "Next Friday against Lincoln High." The conversation was cut short by the arrival of their bus, its brakes squealing slightly as it pulled up to the curb. Andrew let the elderly passengers board first, something his mom had taught him since he was little. "Kindness doesn't cost anything," she would say, "but it means everything." Inside the bus, Andrew found his usual spot near the middle, where he could keep an eye on everything happening around him. The familiar bumps and turns of the route had become like a morning lullaby over the past 2 years. He pulled out his physics notebook for one last review, but his attention kept drifting to the lives unfolding around him. A young mother was trying to calm her fussy toddler while balancing a coffee cup. Without drawing attention, Andrew offered her his seat when she struggled to stay standing during a sharp turn. She thanked him with a grateful smile that reminded him of his mom's tired eyes after a long day of work. The bus radio crackled with news about rising prices and economic challenges, making several passengers exchange worried glances. Andrew understood those concerns all too well. Just last week, he'd overheard his mom on the phone discussing payment plans for their heating bill. That's why he'd started saving his lunch money, doing odd jobs on weekends, and tutoring younger kids in math when he could. Looking out the window, he watched the neighborhood gradually change as they moved downtown. The familiar brick buildings and corner stores gave way to gleaming office towers and busy shopping districts. Andrew often wondered about the people rushing in and out of those fancy buildings, wearing suits that probably cost more than his mom's monthly rent. But his mom had taught him never to envy others. "Everyone's fighting their own battles," she would say. As the bus approached downtown, more passengers crowded in, filling every available space. The morning chatter grew louder, a mix of phone conversations, morning greetings, and the occasional complaint about the weather or traffic. Andrew noticed a few new faces today, including a well-dressed man who seemed oddly interested in observing his fellow passengers instead of staring at his phone like most commuters. Andrew checked his watch again. They were right on schedule. He'd make it to school with enough time to help his friend with math homework before first period. His mind was already planning out the day: classes until 3:30, basketball practice until 6 o'clock, then home to help with chores and tackle his homework. It was a packed schedule, but Andrew wouldn't have it any other way. Each day was a step closer to his dreams, and he was determined to make them reality. Little did he know that this ordinary morning commute was about to become anything but ordinary. As the bus made its next stop, an elderly woman would step on, setting in motion a chain of events that would change Andrew's life forever. But in that moment, he was just another teenager on the bus, heading to school, carrying his dreams in a worn backpack, and living by the values his mother had instilled in him. The bus lurched to a stop at the busy downtown intersection, its doors hissing open to welcome another wave of morning passengers. Andrew had just put away his physics notes when something caught his attention. Among the crowd of suited professionals and morning commuters, an elderly woman stood at the front of the bus, her hands trembling as she dug through a small cloth purse. She wore clothes that had seen better days, a faded blue sweater with carefully mended holes, and shoes that were worn at the edges. But there was dignity in how she carried herself, despite her obvious struggle with the handful of coins she was trying to count. The morning light streaming through the bus windows caught the silver in her hair, and Andrew noticed how her fingers, marked with age spots, moved slowly over each coin. "That's not enough," the bus driver announced, his voice carrying over the mumble of conversations and traffic noise. "Fare went up last week. You're short by $2. The woman's face fell, worry lines deepening around her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice carrying a slight accent. "I didn't know about the increase. Maybe I could." "Look, lady," the driver cut in, his patience wearing thin as the line behind her grew longer. "I can't let you ride without the full fare. Rules are rules. You need to step off so others can board." Andrew watched as the other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some pretended to be deeply absorbed in their phones, while others stayed out the windows, suddenly very interested in the same buildings they passed every day. A businessman in an expensive suit actually pulled out his AirPods to block out the situation, while a young woman in scrubs looked torn between helping and staying quiet. The elderly woman's hands were shaking more now as she tried to search deeper in her purse. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to get to the medical center. My appointment." "I said step off," the driver repeated, louder this time. "You're holding up the whole bus." Someone near the back called out, "Come on, we're going to be late." This was followed by a few agreeing mumbles from other passengers, each caught up in their own morning rush. Andrew felt something twist in his stomach. He thought about his own grandmother, who had passed away 3 years ago. She used to tell him stories about coming to this country with nothing but hope and determination. This woman reminded him of her, the same quiet dignity, the same careful way of handling what little she had. The woman started to turn away from the fare box, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Andrew could see tears beginning to form in her eyes, though she was trying hard to hold them back. The medical papers clutched in her other hand crumpled slightly as her grip tightened. A businessman checking his expensive watch sighed loudly. "Some of us have important meetings to get to," he muttered, just loud enough for others to hear. A few people nodded in agreement, while others continued to look away, perhaps ashamed of their own inaction, but not willing to step forward. The scene playing out before him brought back memories of his mom's words from just last week. They'd been watching a documentary about people helping others during tough times, and she'd said, "You know, son, sometimes the real test of a person isn't in the big moments everyone sees. It's in those quiet moments when doing the right thing might cost you something." Andrew looked down at his pocket, feeling the weight of the money he'd saved for lunch and after-school snacks. He'd been carefully saving up these past weeks, planning to buy new basketball shoes for the upcoming game. His current ones were starting to wear out, and he knew proper gear mattered when scouts came to watch. But as he watched the elderly woman slowly turn toward the door, her dignity intact but her spirit clearly broken, Andrew knew what he had to do. Sometimes, he realized, the most important choices in life don't feel like choices at all. They're just moments when your heart tells you what's right, and all you have to do is listen. The woman had taken one step toward the door when Andrew stood up, his heart pounding but his voice steady. What happened next would set in motion a chain of events that would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone involved in this seemingly ordinary morning scene. None of them knew it yet, but this moment, this simple choice between walking past or standing up, would create ripples that would reach far beyond that crowded city bus. Andrew rose from his seat, his movements calm but deliberate. The bus had fallen into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the rumble of the engine and distant traffic sounds. He could feel eyes turning toward him as he made his way to the front, his hand already reaching into his pocket for the money he'd been saving. "I've got it," he said, his voice clear and steady despite his racing heart. The elderly woman turned back, surprise flickering across her weathered face. Andrew stepped forward, counting out the fare from his carefully saved lunch money. "Here's the full fare, sir," he said to the driver, dropping the coins into the collection box with a familiar clink. The woman's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, perhaps recognition of a kindness she hadn't expected to find that morning. "Young man," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I can't accept." "Please," Andrew said softly, gesturing toward an empty seat nearby. "It's okay. Let me help you with your bag." The one campus bag she carried looked heavy with what appeared to be medical files and prescription bottles. As they moved toward the seat, the earlier tension on the bus seemed to dissolve. The businessman who had complained about being late suddenly found great interest in his shoes. A few passengers exchanged glances that carried a hint of shame, while others offered small smiles of approval. Once seated, the woman introduced herself as Mrs. Chen, a retired music teacher. 30 years I taught children to play piano," she shared, her accent carrying traces of both pride and nostalgia. "But now, times are different. The arthritis makes it hard to play, and the medical bills." She trailed off, looking down at her hands. Andrew listened as the bus continued its journey through the city streets. He learned that Mrs. Chen had taught at the very same community center where he sometimes played basketball. Her eyes lit up when she spoke about her former students, some of whom had gone on to become professional musicians. "But why?" she asked suddenly, turning to look at him. "Why help a stranger when everyone else looked away?" Andrew thought about his mom, about all the times he'd seen her help others even when they were struggling themselves. He thought about the nights she came home exhausted from her second job, but still made time to ask about his day. "My mom always says that we're all connected," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "That helping others isn't just about the money or the act itself, it's about remembering we're all human, all trying our best." Mrs. Chen reached out and patted his hand, her touch gentle but firm. "Your mother raised a good son," she said simply. Then, reaching into her bag, she pulled out something wrapped in tissue paper. "Here. I always carry an extra mooncake. My grandson, he's about your age. He says I worry too much about everyone going hungry." She smiled, offering him the small package. What neither of them noticed was the well-dressed man sitting a few rows back, observing the entire interaction with intense interest. He hadn't touched his phone once, unlike the other business passengers. Instead, he watched as Andrew and Mrs. Chen continued to talk, noting how the young man listened with genuine interest to her stories about music and teaching. As the bus approached the medical center, Andrew helped Mrs. Chen gather her things. "Which department are you headed to?" he asked, noticing her slight wince as she stood. "Rheumatology," she replied. "These old joints aren't what they used to be, but don't worry about me, young man. You've done more than enough, and you'll be late for school." Andrew glanced at his watch. He'd miss his chance to help his friend with math homework, but somehow that didn't seem so important anymore. "I've got a few minutes," he said. "The hospital entrance can be confusing. Let me at least make sure you find the right department." As they stepped off the bus together, neither Andrew nor Mrs. Chen realized that this simple act of kindness had set much bigger things in motion. The well-dressed observer had already pulled out his phone, making a quiet but urgent call. Sometimes the smallest choices made from the heart can open doors we never even knew existed. Andrew walked Mrs. Chen to the hospital entrance, made sure she knew where to go, and promised to visit the community center sometime to hear more about her teaching days. As he turned to leave, she called out to him one last time. "In my culture," she said, her voice carrying across the morning air, "we believe that true kindness always finds its way back to the giver. Remember that, young man. Remember that." With those words hanging in the air, Andrew hurried toward school, already thinking about how he'd need to budget his remaining money for the week. But despite the hit to his savings, he felt lighter somehow, as if he'd gained something far more valuable than what he'd given up. The well-dressed man who had watched everything unfold on the bus sat in his corner office on the 47th floor of the city's tallest building. Mr. Lee had built his tech company from nothing into a billion-dollar enterprise, but today his mind wasn't on profit margins or board meetings. Instead, he kept replaying the scene he had witnessed that morning. He hadn't planned to take the bus. His usual routine involved a private car service and carefully scheduled appointments. But that morning, something had felt off. Maybe it was the dream he had about his mother, who had passed away 6 months ago. She had always criticized his growing disconnect from ordinary people, saying success means nothing if you forget where you came from. So, on impulse, he had decided to take the bus just like he used to 20 years ago when he was starting out. Get to know how your employees live, his mother's voice had echoed in his head. Now, sitting in his leather chair, looking out over the city skyline, he knew it wasn't coincidence that had put him on that particular bus. "Send in Ms. Wong," he spoke into his intercom. His assistant entered promptly, tablet in hand, ready for her usual morning briefing. Instead, Mr. Lee surprised her with an unusual request. "I need you to find someone for me." A young man, probably 16 or 17, takes the number 23 bus downtown every morning, wears a blue school backpack with a basketball hanging from it. Ms. Wong's eyebrows rose slightly, but she remained professional. "Any other details, sir?" Mr. Lee closed his eyes for a moment, recalling the scene. He was reading a physics textbook. Advanced placement, from what I could see. He gave up his lunch money to help an elderly woman with her bus fare. "I want to know everything about him, his school, his family situation, his dreams." "Sir," Ms. Wong hesitated, "are you sure about this? It's not our usual." "I watched that young man do something remarkable today," Mr. Lee interrupted, standing up to look out his window. Below, he could see the busy streets, tiny figures rushing about their day. In a bus full of adults, including myself, he was the only one who acted. No hesitation, no showing off, just pure instinct to help someone in need. He turned back to his assistant, his expression thoughtful. "You know what my mother used to say about success?" Ms. Wong shook her head. She said true success isn't about having the biggest office or the most money. It's about making a difference in someone's life when you have the chance. Mr. Lee walked to a framed photo on his wall. A much younger version of himself standing next to an elderly woman in a small grocery store. 25 years ago, someone took a chance on me. A high school kid with big dreams but empty pockets. One person believed in me, gave me an opportunity. Today, I think I saw someone who deserves that same chance. Ms. Wong was already typing on her tablet. "I'll contact our security team to get the bus camera footage. We can probably trace his route, figure out which school he attends." "Do it quietly," Mr. Lee instructed. "And one more thing, find out about that elderly woman too. The one he helped. Something tells me there's more to her story as well." As his assistant left, Mr. Lee picked up his phone to cancel his afternoon appointments. This was more important. He thought about the young man's instant decision to help, despite clearly not being well off himself. That kind of character couldn't be taught in any business school. He remembered watching how the boy had listened to the elderly woman's stories, showing genuine interest and respect. In a world where everyone was busy looking at screens or rushing to their next meeting, this teenager had shown a humanity that touched something deep in Mr. Lee's heart. The morning sun cast long shadows across his office floor as he began making calls. His mother had always told him to trust his instincts, and right now, every instinct was telling him this was important. Sometimes, he realized, the biggest business decisions weren't about business at all. They were about recognizing something genuine and valuable in another human being. As he worked through his contacts, making arrangements for what would come next, Mr. Lee felt more energized than he had in months. Tomorrow morning, a Mercedes would pull up to a modest house in the city, carrying not just an opportunity, but a chance to prove that kindness, character, and compassion still mattered in this fast-paced world. But first, he had some homework to do. Understanding the young man's background, his challenges, and his dreams would be crucial. This wasn't about charity. It was about investment in human potential. Mr. Lee smiled, thinking how his mother would approve of his actions today. Sometimes, the best way to honor those we've lost is to help those who remind us of the values they taught us. The sun was setting over the city skyline when Ms. Wong knocked on Mr. Lee's office door, holding a thick folder. Her usually perfect hair showed signs of a long, busy day, but her eyes sparkled with excitement. "Sir, you're going to want to see this." She spread the contents of the folder across his desk: security camera footage, school records, newspaper clippings, and various documents that together painted a picture of an extraordinary young man's life. His name is Andra, and his story is remarkable. The security footage showed Andra's daily routine, getting on the bus early each morning, often helping elderly passengers with their bags or giving up his seat without being asked. "The bus drivers know him well," Ms. Wong explained. They said he's been doing this kind of thing for years, not just today. Mr. Lee picked up a school newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Student starts free tutoring program for middle school kids." The article showed Andra teaching math to younger students at the community center, the same place where Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman from the bus, used to teach piano. His academic record is outstanding, Ms. Wang continued, pulling out more papers. Top of his class in physics and mathematics. But here's what's really interesting. He's doing all this while helping support his family. She showed Mr. Lee another document. Andrew's mother worked 2 jobs at a local diner and a convenience store. After his father passed away 5 years ago, they'd struggled to make ends meet. Yet somehow, Andra had maintained straight A's while working part-time on weekends, tutoring other students, and staying active in school sports. The basketball coach says he's their star player, Ms. Wang added, showing a recent sports article. College scouts are starting to notice him. But here's the thing, they'd found an old pair of basketball shoes in his locker, held together with tape. He's been saving up for new ones, but he gave that money to Mrs. Chen today instead. Mr. Lee finished quietly, remembering the scene on the bus. Ms. Wang nodded, then pulled out another set of documents. About Mrs. Chen, we found her too. She taught music at the community center for 30 years, touched hundreds of lives. When arthritis forced her to retire, she lost her health insurance. She's been trying to get treatment, but the costs. Mr. Lee stood up and walked to his window, watching the city lights come alive as darkness fell. What about Andrew's dreams? Did you find anything about his plans for the future? Ms. Wang smiled and pulled out a college application essay draft she'd obtained from Andrew's guidance counselor. He wants to study engineering. His essay talks about wanting to design affordable housing solutions for low-income families. He writes about watching his mom worry about rent and promising himself he'd find a way to help others in similar situations. The essay was clearly written from the heart, talking about community, responsibility, and the dream of making a real difference in people's lives. One line stood out. Success isn't just about what you achieved for yourself, but about how many others you can lift up along the way. Mr. Lee sat back down, deeply moved by what he was reading. There's more, Ms. Wang continued. The diner where his mom works morning shifts. They say she always sets aside leftover food for homeless people in the area. Even with their own struggles, they're always thinking of others. She pulled out one final document, a letter from Andrew's physics teacher. His teacher says he's never seen a student with such natural talent combined with such humility. Apparently, Andrew solved a complex problem that even the teacher struggled with, but instead of bragging, he stayed after class to help other students understand it. As they reviewed everything, a clear picture emerged of not just a bright student, but a young man with extraordinary character. The kind of person who would give up his savings to help a stranger, who would work extra hours to help his family, who would use his talents to lift others up. Mr. Lee carefully gathered all the documents, his decision already made. Ms. Wang, I need you to set up a few things for tomorrow morning. First, call our scholarship foundation. Then, contact our engineering department about creating a new internship position. And finally, he smiled, make sure my schedule is clear. I want to deliver this news personally. As Ms. Wang left to make the arrangements, Mr. Lee looked one more time at the college essay. The words seemed to leap off the page. My mom always says that opportunities come to those who create them for others first. Tomorrow, he would prove just how right that statement was. The investigation had revealed more than just facts and figures. It had shown the ripple effects of kindness, the strength of character in the face of adversity, and the type of person who could truly make a difference in the world. Now it was time to open a door that could change not just one life, but potentially many more through the dreams of a young man who already understood what truly mattered in life. The morning sun had barely touched the windows of their small apartment when Andrew's mom arrived home from her night shift at the convenience store. She was surprised to find Andrew already awake, sitting at their tiny kitchen table with his physics homework spread out before him. "Everything okay, baby?" she asked, hanging up her worn coat. She could always tell when something was on her son's mind. "Just thinking, Mom," Andrew replied, fiddling with his pencil. He hadn't told her about giving away his shoe money yesterday. He knew she'd understand. She'd probably even be proud, but he didn't want her to worry about him needing new shoes for the upcoming game. The peaceful morning quiet was suddenly interrupted by the unusual sound of a car pulling up outside their building. In their neighborhood, most people took the bus or walked. The deep purr of what was clearly an expensive engine drew both their attention to the window. Andrew's mom pushed aside the one curtain and gasped. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. A sleek black Mercedes had parked right in front of their building. The kind of car they usually only saw driving past their neighborhood on its way downtown. The car's door opened and out stepped a distinguished-looking Asian man in an impeccable suit. He was followed by a woman carrying a leather portfolio, both of them heading straight for their building's entrance. "Anda," his mom said slowly, "are you sure there's nothing you need to tell me about?" Before he could answer, there was a knock at their door. They looked at each other, momentarily frozen. Another gentle knock. Andrew's mom straightened her work uniform and smoothed her hair before opening the door. The well-dressed man smiled warmly. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm Mr. Lee, CEO of Tomorrow Tech. And this is my assistant, Ms. Wong. We're here to speak with you and your son, Andra." Andra felt his heart skip a beat as he recognized the man from the bus yesterday. His mom, still processing this unexpected situation, did what she always did when visitors arrived. She offered hospitality. "Please come in," she said, quickly clearing some space in their small living room. "I'm sorry about the mess we weren't expecting." She trailed off, clearly wondering what would bring such important people to their door. Mr. Lee sat down on their well-worn couch, seeming completely at ease despite the humble surroundings. "Actually, Mrs. Johnson, I was hoping to talk to you both about something I witnessed yesterday morning." Andrew's mom looked at her son, questions in her eyes. Mr. Lee continued, "I was on the number 23 bus yesterday, something I haven't done in years. My mother always said sometimes we need to step out of our comfort zones to see what really matters in life." He turned to Andra. "Young man, I saw what you did for Mrs. Chen, but more importantly, I saw how you did it, with dignity, respect, and without hesitation." Andrew's mom looked confused. "Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who needed help with her bus fare," Mr. Lee explained. "Your son gave up his savings to help her, then made sure she got safely to her medical appointment." Tears welled up in his mom's eyes as she looked at Andra. "That's my boy," she said softly, pride evident in her voice. Ms. Wong opened her portfolio and began laying out documents on their small coffee table. "We did some research," she explained. "Andrew's academic record, his community service, his character references, they're all exceptional." Mr. Lee leaned forward. "Mrs. Johnson, I came from a background not unlike Andrew's. A single mother who worked multiple jobs, big dreams but limited resources. Then someone took a chance on me, opened a door I never even knew existed. Today, I'd like to do the same for your son." Andrew's mom reached for his hand, squeezing it tight. The morning sun streamed through their window, catching the tears on her cheeks. "But first," Mr. Lee said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "I believe these belong to a very special lady." He pulled out a set of bus passes. "These are for Mrs. Chen, a lifetime of free rides. My company is also arranging for her medical care. Sometimes one act of kindness reveals needs we never knew existed." Andrew's mom was openly crying now, overwhelmed by the moment. Their small apartment, which had always felt a bit cramped, suddenly seemed filled with possibility. The morning light painted everything in a golden glow, as if the universe itself was holding its breath for what would come next. Mr. Lee smiled, his own eyes glistening with emotion. "Now about Andrew's future," he began, as Ms. Wong pulled out more documents from her portfolio. The sound of the busy street outside faded away as they all leaned forward, ready to hear what tomorrow might bring. That afternoon, Andrew took the bus to the community center. He found Mrs. Chen there, beaming as she showed him the new adaptive piano equipment being installed. "Your kindness," she said, patting his hand, "it came back to you just like I said it would." As he watched her fingers move tentatively over the keys, playing a few notes for the first time in months, Andrew understood something profound. Success wasn't just about getting ahead. It was about bringing others along with you. His mother's words rang in his ears. "We rise by lifting others." Walking home that evening, Andrew looked up at the city skyline, the tall buildings glowing in the setting sun. Tomorrow, he would start a journey he never thought possible. But more importantly, he had learned that one simple act of kindness could create ripples that changed not just one life, but many. His phone buzzed, a message from Mr. Lay, Monday morning, 8 a.m. Wear comfortable shoes. We've got work to do. P.S. Check your front door. Racing up the stairs to his apartment, Andrew found a shoebox wrapped in simple brown paper. Inside were the newest model of basketball shoes, his exact size. The note read, "Every dream starts with a single step. Make them count." Andrew smiled, understanding that this wasn't just about shoes or scholarships or even opportunities. It was about the endless possibilities that open up when we choose to help others, even when, especially when, no one expects us to.